Hello everyone, and welcome to the 20 Years of TIMSS International Trends in Mathematics and Science Achievement Curriculum and Instruction. My name is Lydia Malley, and I work on International Studies at the National Center for Education Statistics. I am the U.S. National Research Coordinator for the International Computer and Information Literacy Study and the Co-Project Officer for TIMSS. I'd like to welcome you all to the RISE webinar series, which puts a spotlight on research relating to international studies in education on a bi-monthly basis. Before we get started, I would like to highlight a few technical and logistic items. This webinar will be listen only. If you experience technical difficulty during the webinar, you can either contact the RISE team by email at the RISE email address, rise@air.org, or via the questions box on the right-hand side of your screen. Someone from the RISE team will assist you. You may ask questions about the presentation at any time during today's webinar by submitting your questions to the questions box in the right-hand menu. At the end of this presentation, there will be a question and answer session in which the panelists will respond to content-related questions received throughout the webinar. Now I'd like to introduce each of our panelists and the subject of today's webinar. Our presenters, Dr. Ina V.S. Mullis and Dr. Michael O. Martin, are executive directors of the TIMSS and Pearls International Study Center at Boston College. Beginning with TIMSS 1995 and then in founding Pearls, over her 20 years with IEA, Ina has played a key leadership role in building TIMSS and Pearls into the global assessment programs they are today. Prior to joining Boston College in 1994, Ina was project director of the National Assessment of Educational Progress, or NAEP, at Educational Testing Service, and she serves on the NAEP Validation Studies panel. Dr. Michael or Mick Martin is Executive Director of the TIMSS and Pearls International Study Center, along with Ina. Since his early work on IEA's 1991 Reading Literacy Study through TIMSS 1995, the founding of Pearls in 2001, and now 20 years of TIMSS Trends, he has built a long-standing reputation for excellence in international assessment. Before joining Boston College, he was a research fellow at the Educational Research Centre at St. Patrick's College, Dublin, where he directed Ireland's national surveys of student achievement and served as Ireland's national project representative for major international student surveys. Following Ina and Mick, Dr. Jack Buckley will speak as a discussant. Dr. Jack Buckley is Senior Vice President at the American Institutes for Research. He leads AIR's research and evaluation area, where he oversees projects across our entire range of subject areas, including education, health, and the workforce, both in the United States and internationally. Jack has a strong background in applied statistics and education research. Before joining AIR, he helped lead the redesign of the SAT at the College Board, where he served as Senior Vice President of Research and was responsible for all research and psychometrics across their entire range of products and services. Before that, he served as Commissioner of the U.S. Department of Education's National Center for Education Statistics. Jack is known for his research on school choice, particularly charter schools, and on statistical methods for public policy and education. We are very excited to have these speakers with us today. At this time, I will turn things over to Ina and Mick.
Good morning, everybody. Thank you, Lydia, for that nice introduction, and greetings from Boston College. We are very pleased to have this chance this morning to present some highlights from 20 years of TIMSS. I will begin by saying a few words about trends in student achievement, and then Ina will reflect on developments in curriculum, instruction, and student attitudes toward mathematics and science. For more than 2 decades, IEA's TIMSS has been monitoring trends in mathematics and science achievement around the world. Directed by the TIMSS and Pearls International Study Center at Boston College, TIMSS assesses students at the 4th and 8th grades every 4 years, with 57 countries and 7 benchmarking participants in TIMSS 2015, the most recent one. This was the 6th TIMSS assessment, and a very special one, providing 20 years of trends and giving countries an in-depth look at student performance over time. The assessments reflect how countries organize curriculum, addressing key transition points in schooling, the 4th grade, the 8th grade, and the final year of secondary school. TIMSS Advanced is the only international assessment of students in STEM programs in their final year of secondary school. It has been conducted 3 times, and 9 countries participated in TIMSS Advanced 2015. Altogether, more than 600,000 students were assessed in 2015, based on more than 1,000 achievement items in mathematics and science. The TIMSS assessments are rooted in countries' mathematics and science curricula, and based on countries' shared expectations of what students should know and be able to do. There were 17 countries with 20 years of trend data in TIMSS at the 4th grade and 16 at the 8th grade, with the United States taking part at both grades. In general, there was improvement across the years, with more countries having increases than decreases in student achievement. In 4th grade mathematics in 2015, the 5 East Asian countries performed above the rest: Singapore and Hong Kong, followed by Korea, Chinese Taipei, and Japan. A 23-point gap set them apart from the next highest scoring countries: Northern Ireland, the Russian Federation, Norway, Ireland, England, the Flemish-speaking part of Belgium, Kazakhstan, and Portugal. The 20-year trend showed greatest improvement in mathematics at the 4th grade, with 14 countries, including the United States, having higher average achievement, 1 unchanged, and 2 with lower achievement. In 8th grade mathematics in 2015, Singapore had the highest achievement as well, followed by Korea and Chinese Taipei, then Hong Kong, and then Japan. The next highest achieving countries included the Russian Federation, Kazakhstan, Canada, Ireland, England, the United States, Slovenia, and Hungary. The gap between the top performers and the next highest scoring countries was even wider at the 8th grade, 48 points. The 20-year trend results for 8th grade mathematics were not as encouraging as for 4th grade, with 9 countries increasing, 4 the same, and 3 decreasing. But again, the United States was among those with increased achievement. In science at the 4th grade, Singapore and Korea outperformed all other countries, followed by Japan and the Russian Federation. The next highest achievers included Hong Kong, Chinese Taipei, Finland, Kazakhstan, Poland, and the United States. Over the 20-year period in science at the 4th grade, achievement was up in 11 countries, unchanged in 4, and down in 2. The United States was in the unchanged group. In science at the 8th grade, Singaporean students were again the highest achievers, and Japan and Chinese Taipei also made it to the top, followed by Korea and Slovenia. Among the next highest achievers were Hong Kong, Russian Federation, England, Kazakhstan, Ireland, and the United States. The 20-year trend results for science at the 8th grade were similar to those for mathematics, with 9 countries improving, including the United States, 4 staying the same, and 3 with lower achievement. Over the 20 years of TIMSS, the United States has shown a modest, steady improvement in mathematics at both 4th and 8th grades, with an increase in average achievement of more than 20 points over the period. There's been a similar steady increase in 8th grade science, with a growth in average achievement of 17 points. The increase at 4th grade science is much smaller, partly because the performance of 4th grade students, US 4th grade students in 1995 was relatively good compared to students in other countries. Since 2003, US 4th graders have maintained a steady but modest increase. Students who participated in TIMSS Advanced were in their final year of secondary school and had taken advanced mathematics or physics courses in preparation for university study and careers in STEM areas. These are very select students, with the percentage of the cohort in advanced programs ranging from 2% for the most select mathematics students in the Russian Federation to 34% for Slovenia, the country with the highest proportion of students studying advanced mathematics. In contrast to the peak levels of mathematics achievement at the 4th and 8th grades, the 9 countries in TIMSS Advanced generally had lower performance overall. With just 2 exceptions, the country's average achievement in mathematics fell below the scale center point of 500 to a low of 422. In physics, the percentage of students in the cohort taking advanced courses ranged from 4% in Lebanon to 22% in France. For some countries, performance in physics dipped even lower than for advanced mathematics, with France and Italy, the countries with the highest proportion of students taking physics, having the lowest average performance. The 20-year trend data for TIMSS Advanced showed disappointing results in both advanced mathematics and physics. None of the 6 countries with 20-year trend data improved in either subject. In advanced mathematics, half the countries had lower achievement than in 1995, and the rest, including the United States, were essentially unchanged. In physics, 4 countries had lower achievement, and just 2 managed to maintain the status quo, of which the United States was 1. In 1995, average achievement of US students in TIMSS Advanced was among the lowest in mathematics and was actually the lowest in physics. There is little evidence of any improvement in the intervening years. In fact, there was a small decrease for both subjects, although this decrease was within the margin of error. But here it is. To help countries understand the specifics of what students know and can do in mathematics and science, TIMSS characterizes achievement at 4 international benchmarks: advanced, high, intermediate, and low, and reports the percentages of students reaching these benchmarks in each country. Results at the 4th grade were similar for mathematics and science. In 2015, almost all students reached the low international benchmark, which represents a basic level of achievement, but only 6% reached the advanced benchmark in mathematics and 7% in science. Remarkably, of the 17 countries with 20 years of TIMSS data at the 4th grade, 13 raised achievement in mathematics across their entire distribution, improving at each of the 4 benchmarks from low to advanced. The United States was included in this group. In 4th grade science, 8 of the 17 countries raised achievement at all 4 benchmarks. 7 countries, including Cyprus, Hong Kong, Iran, Japan, Korea, Singapore, and Slovenia, raised achievement at all 4 benchmarks in both mathematics and science. Results at the 8th grade were almost as positive, and also similar for mathematics and science. On average, countries educated 84% of their students to a basic level of mathematics and science achievement, with 5 to 7% reaching the advanced benchmark. Long-term improvements at the 8th grade were a little less impressive than at the 4th grade. Of the 16 countries with 20 years of TIMSS data, 5 of them, including the United States, raised achievement in mathematics across their entire distribution, improving at each of the 4 benchmarks. Only 4 countries managed this at 8th grade science. Lithuania and Slovenia were the only countries to raise achievement at all 4 benchmarks in both mathematics and science. 20 years ago, TIMSS 95 found that gender differences in mathematics achievement were generally small, although in countries where there were differences, it was always boys who had higher achievement. The boys' advantage in science was more pronounced, with boys outperforming girls in about half the countries at 4th grade and almost all countries at 8th grade. The 2015 results show a narrowing of the gender gap in achievement, especially in science and especially at the 8th grade. In mathematics at the 4th grade, the modest advantage held by boys in 95, it was 5 score points on average, was unchanged in 2015. However, with an average difference of 9 points, the gender gap was larger in science at the 4th grade in 95. By 2015, this difference had fallen to 3 points, such that gender gaps in science and mathematics were now comparable, 5 points and 3 points. The 8th grade mathematics gender gap in 1995 was similar to the 4th grade, with just 6 points on average. By 2015, this difference had fallen to 2 points. Singapore, which had gender parity in mathematics achievement in 1995, was the only 20-year trend country in 2015 where girls outperformed boys by a difference of 9 points. 8th grade science had the largest gender gap in 1995. Boys outperformed girls in all but one of the countries with an average advantage of 21 points. However, by 2015, the gap had almost completely closed, falling to just 2 points on average. Despite this remarkable narrowing of the gap, girls did not have higher science achievement than boys in any of the 20-year trend countries. TIMSS Advanced 95 showed that there were more boys than girls enrolled in advanced programs, especially in physics, and that boys had higher achievement than girls on average. By 2015, there was an increase in the proportion of girls taking advanced mathematics, notably in the United States, but little change in the achievement gap. Boys still outperform girls by about 20 scale score points. In physics, however, although boys continue to outnumber girls by a ratio of 3 to 2, there has been a considerable narrowing of the achievement gap. The 53-point advantage held by boys in 1995 was reduced by almost one half to 28 points in 2015. And now Ina will talk about curriculum instruction and student attitudes. Ina?
Thank you, Mick. I'm very happy to be talking with everyone this morning. TIMSS collects extensive data about students' school and classroom contexts for learning mathematics and science, and there have been some interesting changes internationally across the past 20 years. Just as the curriculum in the United States continually is undergoing revision from state to state, nearly all of the TIMSS countries have implemented periodic curriculum reforms ranging from updates to full-scale revisions. There has been an increased emphasis on cognitive domains, thinking, communicating, and problem-solving skills, as well as inquiry and investigation skills in science. And content topics have moved down the grades to the extent that the mathematics and science curriculum often begins in pre-primary school. Consistent with updates in curriculum, there has been a global movement to improve teacher education. Countries have increased the required number of years of education it takes to become a teacher from 3 years in teacher training institution to a 4-year university degree or master's degree in many countries. Also, some countries have tightened admissions criteria for teacher and education programs by requiring interviews, minimum GPAs, and testing candidates. To increase certification requirements, some countries have initiated new oral or written qualifying examinations or mandated a probationary period that includes an induction program or monitoring by an experienced teacher. It is good teachers are better prepared because they are faced with delivering what may be more complex curricula in about the same amount of instructional time as 20 years ago. Internationally, at the 4th grade, instructional time decreased in mathematics by 14 hours per year and was slightly less in science. At the 8th grade, mathematics instructional time was slightly more, and science instructional time increased by 15 hours. So even though things don't look very much changed, it could be that there are several weeks less of mathematics instruction and several weeks more of mathematics instruction than there was in 1995. As a point of interest, in 2015, the United States provided more instructional time in mathematics and science than the international averages at both 4th and 8th grades. Generally, TIMSS 2015 found 4th and 8th grade students were in positive school environments. Perhaps most importantly, teachers judged schools to be more safe and orderly than in 2007. School safety can be considered fundamental to fostering higher levels of academic achievement. At 4th grade in 2007, internationally, less than half the students were in very safe schools. But this rose to 69% in 2015. Similarly, at 8th grade, it increased from 39 to 63%. Approximately 1/4 more of the students were in very safe schools in 2015. Here, the United States had somewhat fewer students in very safe schools, 55% at 4th grade and 46% at 8th grade. The parents of the majority of students, 59%, were very satisfied with the performance of their child's school, and only 6% were less than satisfied. Parental support and involvement in school goals and initiatives can further school success. Overall, school effectiveness also can be attributed to a school's emphasis on academic success, or the school's expectation for academic excellence. So, it is good news that internationally, teachers reported that in 2015, more students were in schools that emphasized academic success. The shift was from fewer students in schools with medium emphasis to more students in schools with high or even very high emphasis, an increase at fourth grade of 12 percentage points and at eighth grade of 18 percentage points. In 2015, though, the United States had 41% of fourth grade and 55% at eighth grade in the medium category, closer to the international levels in 2007. According to principals, there has been little change in the degree to which the quality of instruction is affected by resource shortages, which included general areas such as materials and supplies and buildings and grounds, as well as areas specific to mathematics and science, such as technology and laboratories. If anything, in 2015, a few more students were in schools affected a lot by resource shortages, especially at the eighth grade, where this increased to 15%. However, there was substantial variation from country to country, with some countries having more difficulty keeping up with the curve of what constitutes a well-resourced school in today's technology-based world. The integration of technology into countries' curricula and instruction likely is the biggest change in the past 2 decades. About 90% of the TIMSS countries reported ICT initiatives. Countries reported using technology to make instruction more efficient and engaging through simulations, animations, and internet activities. Teachers reported more increases in computer use at fourth grade than eighth grade, and more increased use in science lessons than mathematics lessons. Interestingly, Singapore, a perpetually high-performing TIMSS country, has been working on education technology policies for many years, building iteratively on the foundation of public discussions of how to improve its 3 previous policies. It introduced its 4th technology master plan in 2015. As shown here, there has been considerable increase internationally in the percentage of students reporting a computer at home, from 80% or so to 93%. In 2015, most students had access to a computer at home. In contrast, teachers did not report increased availability of computers for mathematics and science lessons. Consistent with principals' reports about increased resource shortages at the 8th grade, in 2015, teachers reported that only 32% of the 8th grade students had access to computers for mathematics lessons and 43% for science lessons. The United States was above the international figures at 39% and 51%, respectively. Finally, an important topic in educational research is the relationship between students' attitudes towards a subject and academic achievement. Across its 20 years, TIMSS has collected considerable information about this. Consistent with research worldwide, Students with better attitudes have higher achievement, and vice versa. Students' attitudes towards learning mathematics and science have been stable. Since 1995, most students have said they enjoyed learning mathematics. You can see that the percentages agreeing and disagreeing at the 4th grade are identical in 1995 and 2015, with 85% agreeing. At the 8th grade, the percentages also were very similar between 1995 and 2015, although somewhat more positive in 2015. Still, it is a matter for concern that positive attitudes drop at the 8th grade. The percentage of students disagreeing doubled from 4th to 8th grade. Based on the TIMSS scales at 4th grade, 81% of the 4th graders liked learning mathematics, 53 in the United States, although 81% still like learning science. At the 8th grade, only 61% like learning mathematics, even though 81% still like learning science. Finally, by TIMSS Advanced in the final year of secondary school, the very much category was down to 18 to 23% for mathematics and physics. As the content becomes more difficult between 4th and 8th grades, confidence drops substantially. It was relatively strong at the 4th grade, but eroded at the 8th grade, where only 14 and 22% were very confident, and the percentage reporting they were not confident just about doubled in both subjects to 43 and 40%. Thank you very much. And now I'll turn it over to Jack.
Okay, thanks very much, Ina, and good morning, everyone. So I would just add to the introduction, I think what was missing there is just, I'd like to say it's been a privilege to work with Ina and Mick in many different capacities over many years, from being at Boston College for a brief time with you guys to much more in-depth involvement in this project as a former U.S. representative to the General Assembly and the Standing Committee of the IEA. It's been absolutely fascinating to see the evolution of this large-scale cross-national assessment system over these many years. And I think if you don't understand how hard it is to pull something like this off, would challenge you to spend a year working with Mick and Ina to understand just the scope of what it takes to assess these cognitive subjects across so many countries reliably, accurately, dependably over these last 20 years. It's truly an incredible project, and it's a data resource that really is. There's very few other assessments like it, and each of them are sort of special in their own way, as I'll talk about in a minute. But this is one of the gems of international comparative education science. So a word about the U.S. context. Another of our colleagues and a longtime colleague of Mick and Ina, Tom Lovelace, who's at the Brookings Institution, likes to say, hand-wringing about how the U.S. does on international tests contends with baseball as a national pastime. And he is absolutely right, and it's certainly not unique to the U.S., although we have a special flavor of this hand-wringing here. But what happens is every time an international assessment score is released to the public, be it on TIMSS or PEARLS, the Program International Reading and Literacy, or PISA, the Program International Student Assessment, which assesses 15-year-olds in a variety of subjects. Whenever these assessments are released, there's almost an entirely predictable narrative where the U.S. is compared to peers and to itself over time, and there's always a declaration of crisis almost regardless of what the actual data say. And if you step back from that narrative and that sense of crisis that we are almost inured to now after so many years of sort of being told that there's a disaster, and look at what are these real trends over time, how do these different assessment systems fit together, what we see is really what Mick described over the long run in TIMSS, which is that we see some real improvements in the United States at grades 4 and 8 in math and science over 20 years. Some measurable improvements that are not only statistically significant, but I would argue have some educational or substantive significance as well. It's harder always to see that unless you really look at what a score means with respect to sort of item and skill proficiency. But when we look at older grades, so when we look at PISA, which assesses 15-year-olds, so approximately 10th graders, in math and science over the last 15 years, the trend doesn't go back as far, you see essentially that scores are flat. And when you look at the U.S.'s own National Assessment of Educational Progress, or NAEP, you basically see the same thing, right? You see, although the grade levels differ at the higher end, right? You look at 4th and 8th graders in math and science. Science is less often than math. All these trends don't add up perfectly, but in general, you see the same steady march of progress at the lower grade levels and essentially stagnation in the 12th grade in the case of NAEP. And this is something that we've seen, although the trend gets longer and longer, and the relative positioning against other countries obviously changes over time as some of them either accelerate faster or decline. This is sort of the same story that we've been hearing for many years now. So when I used to have the privilege of releasing results like the ones that you just heard Mick and Ina say, I would stop there just like they did and say that's the story, that's the description. And almost invariably we would turn to someone else, usually a policymaker, who would then try to say why. And I will not do that, because one of the things that I would caution anyone, of course, using these data, they are expertly crafted with incredible attention to detail, to measurement precision, to enable us to make comparisons, enable us to measure trends over time. But they are not designed well to tell us why. And that's not their fault, right? Not every data resource or study can be used for every purpose. I think it's important when you look at the history of international assessment, which really even for the case of IEA goes all the way back to the pilot 12-country study back, I guess, in 1960. The problem they were designed to solve was that at that point there was really no way to make any sorts of comparisons, or belief that it was even possible to make these sorts of comparisons, and the belief that it was important to understand what was possible in any given country's education system by looking at what other countries were doing in a systematic, empirical way, and not just simply sort of telling stories about what they thought other countries were doing. And I believe, TIMSS represents sort of the apotheosis of solving that problem. We have now systematically, reliably, with great validity, are able to describe and answer those questions. But they just open the door to more questions, where we want to know what works and why. And to answer those, although TIMSS, like other large-scale assessments, can help us formulate hypotheses and suggest interesting areas for us to explore, is not sufficient all by itself to answer that question about why. And I would encourage anybody, again, who encounters someone making claims on the basis of a large-scale descriptive assessment that they now understand that schools should be smaller, or that technology should be more widespread, or that some other policy should be implemented, that is very unlikely, if not impossible. While the data from those assessments may provide some clue or indication in that direction, that they cannot be conclusive by nature of design. So I think I would just like to conclude, I guess I don't want to conclude on a negative note, and I don't mean that to be one. As I said at the beginning, I remain in awe at the scope and precision of this project, that it continues to exist with great international support and grow and expand, provides not only a model to many countries for their own national assessment systems, but really is responsible for launching an entire area of education studies. And we have, over these last 20 years, greatly been enriched by our ability to see these data and to better understand the world around us across national borders. So thank you both, Mick and Ina, for your never-ending hard work in this program. As someone who's seen it, I can tell you, everyone else, that it is an enormous amount of work, and that their contribution in this area is unmatched.
Thank you, Jack.
Thank you.
And thank you to all of you. Yes?
Well, we just wanted to take a moment to thank Jack for all of his kind words. We really appreciate it.
Yes, and thank you to all of our panelists for that presentation and the discussion. We will now begin the question and answer portion of this presentation. The panelists will now answer questions that you've submitted during the webinar in the questions box. If you have not yet submitted a question, please send your questions through the questions box on the right-hand panel of your screen at this time. In case you miss which question has been asked, the RISE team will copy and paste the questions that are asked to our presenters into the chat box after they are asked aloud. For any additional questions, or if we are unable to reach your question during this Q&A session, please submit it to the RISE webinar series at rise@air.org. Also, a video and audio recording of today's webinar will be available in the coming week at the RISE webinar series webpage. You will receive an email from the RISE webinar series once it has become available. You can also download the PowerPoint presentation slides from today's webinar via the handouts box in the right-hand panel of your screen. For more information on the Trends in International Mathematics and Science Study, please visit the link provided on your screen. I will now start off the Q&A with the first question. Ina and Mick, can you tell us, what does the future of the TIMSS assessment look like?
Oh, well, TIMSS over our 20 years, every cycle, even though we are measuring trends and keep everything the same as much as we can, we also try to have something new. So, for example, in TIMSS 2011, we had TIMSS and Pearls together at the 4th grade. So we had reading, mathematics, and science. That was a great adventure. In 2015, we had TIMSS and TIMSS Advanced together, so that we had achievement from 4th grade all the way through to the end of the final year of secondary school. That was an even bigger adventure. But I think topping all of that, in 2019, we are moving to eTIMSS, which is an electronic version of TIMSS. And this is, of course, very exciting and offers great promise for the future in terms of flexibility, new initiatives, and all that things. We have been working on TIMSS 2019, eTIMSS part of it, for the last 2 years. Our plan is to offer both TIMSS in paper format for countries who want to stick with the older way of doing things, but also in the new electronic format in eTIMSS. And we think more than half our countries are planning to switch to eTIMSS 2019. We have been developing some very interesting new problem-solving and inquiry tasks to capitalize on the new technology. And we're very excited about how those are going to add to the more traditional items we also, of course, will have in TIMSS. The other thing we're very concerned about is maintaining our trends as we switch from paper to E, and also maintaining our link between E and paper. So because of this, we are currently conducting a large-scale item equivalent study with among 27 countries, I think. We're currently collecting data. And this will allow us to reassure ourselves and our countries that we have indeed been able to maintain these links, and we will be able to maintain links and trends going forward. So that's my exciting news about TIMSS 2019.
Thank you very much. That sounds great. Our next question, will go to Jack. How has the notion of equitable science learning as it relates to curriculum and instruction been historically addressed?
So, I mean, that's an interesting question. I can speak to some extent to the U.S. experience. depending on how you choose to define some of these terms. The interesting thing about science in terms of curriculum is it's so many things, right? So, again, at earlier grade levels, it's easier to have a conception of general science, but this is something that we run into as we try to assess concepts and constructs in science as kids age, and as we try to design curriculum and instructional resources. Science is really a bunch of different domains and disciplines that don't hang together all that well, with the exception of some of the central concepts as kids age out into the system. And so coming up with a single science score gets harder the older you get, and I think this is reflected in the TIMSS Advanced, which obviously doesn't try to do advanced general science, but looks at an actual content domain, because by that point in science education, you don't just load or assess kids in their earth science and in their physics and sort of call them all the same thing. So that means that even looking over sort of time historically within grade level and then across grade levels and then trends over time, it's hard to come up with some general conclusions. I think this is one of the reasons why in the U.S. and other places it's been harder to standardize science curriculum and get us to a place where we could say this is what you should know and be able to do at this stage across all these areas of science. And because of that, you see some inequities that cut across not just the traditional ways that we see students from disadvantaged populations underperforming, where we see gaps in science like we do in everywhere else, but you see gaps or differences or inequities in geography as well, where different curricula have been developed or more rigorous in some places at a rate that you see a lot more heterogeneity or variability than you see in something like mathematics. And so I think science has been sort of slower to close those gaps, slower to even understand them and measure them because of those difficulties in measuring general science. Where only now do we see some real effort in this country, but also elsewhere, to try to move science to the same level of measurement and also of curricular and instructional intervention to really close those gaps. So I would argue science has lagged behind to some extent in terms of equity, but that focus has changed recently.
Thank you, Jack. Moving on to our next question, I will turn back to Ina and Mick, and we have a question. You mentioned that teachers are more highly educated. Are there particular countries that have a larger teacher education growth rate, and why might you think that's the case?
Oh, okay. Thank you, Lydia. I wanted to just follow up on Jack's comments for a moment. I think that Jack was explaining some of the difficulties, and we do see a trend from at the fourth grade of countries moving from the general science of the world around us to actually to the content areas, to beginning the separate biology, chemistry, earth science and space science study in the beginning of school, rather than saving it till later. So, and then back to what you asked about, Sarah, I think that most of the increase that we saw, which is a very nice increase, is due to the Bologna process, which is a process that started with the EU in 1998, just, kind of after TIMSS. And by now it has 48 countries that built what they call the European Higher Education Area. And this ensures comparability in the standards and quality of higher education qualifications. So they developed most of the universities in Europe have belonged to the European University Association, and they have worked to develop common degree standards, a structure for bachelor's and master's and doctorates, and the credit system works across countries. So over the same time, they've been building that process during the same time we've been collecting data. And it is something that actually, I think, did show up in the data.
Thanks very much, Ina. Jack, did you have anything to add on that?
No, that makes sense.
Okay. The next question, students seem to be, for the most part, performing much better in math and science, and teachers are more credentialed, and overall education systems seem to be moving in a positive direction internationally. Does this imply that current policies are working to increase educational quality internationally, or are there improvements that could still be made to policy?
So I get to say this now, I think, because I don't have to make those improvements, but I do think that there's still improvements that could be made. I mean, the bottom line, yes, there are some really positive trends. Mick and Ina highlighted a whole bunch of them, both in terms of the cognitive outcomes that they measure, but also in terms of many of these background questions describing student experiences, teacher preparation, a lot of positive news, and that's important to keep that in mind. But for me, I guess I've been studying education about as long as TIMSS has been around, and it's unfortunately remains true that in many places, that assessments like TIMSS reflect fundamental inequities or gaps in student achievement and student resources by the usual variables, right? Whenever we disaggregate by income or socioeconomic status, or in a country that has a significant racial or ethnic minority that's disadvantaged historically, when we disaggregate by that, we see gaps. And to me, as a researcher, until I can fit a model where when I include a factor like that, it just doesn't matter because there aren't any gaps by any of those factors, then there's still more work that could be done.
Sounds good. Ina and Mick, did you have anything to follow up on that?
Well, no, except to say that what I was saying about the gender gap closing to some extent in some of the countries, I think is an example of that. I think people have worked very hard to improve science education for girls, for example, and you can see that, I think. We also see other things happening, however. In some of our countries, we see boys beginning to do less well than girls in mathematics and science, which is sort of a new development. So some gaps close and some gaps open. It's a continuing struggle.
Yes, and I think that most of our countries, always want to do better. I don't think any country will ever be completely satisfied. And the equity issue is really the one that is difficult to make inroads on. And so the closing of the gender gap in science is a nice one. On the other hand, we have our PROS assessment in reading, and there's enormous gap between girls and boys in reading, with girls having the advantage in that case. So I don't think the work of educational improvement will be finished soon.
Thank you. You showed us some trend data on safe and orderly schools, as well as academic emphasis, and we have a question about what you could tell us about those trends in these areas, specifically for the United States.
Oh, I don't know offhand, actually. I know that in 2015, the United States, in terms of safe schools, was below the international averages. And what was the other area? I'm sorry, Sarah, I forget.
Academic emphasis.
Oh, and also in academic emphasis, they are more at the medium, which is our lowest level, more at the medium level internationally than the higher, very high level. So I'm not sure about the trends, but the levels in 2015 are not quite as high as the international averages.
Okay, thank you. Another question is, do we know what is happening in countries like Singapore and Russia as it relates to teacher and leader training in math and science? I could pose this question to Ina and Mick first.
Okay, well, I'll start. They're actually quite different. Singapore is a small place, as we know, and the whole teacher profession and training is part of the national system. So teachers are quite well trained, and they know their mathematics and science quite well, and their pedagogy quite well. And they work for a while, and then they also spend time working together to develop curriculum that they all can use to improve achievement. So it's very much a focused and collaborative and directed effort towards improvement all the way around. The Russia Federation, people talk about diversity in the United States, but I actually believe that the Russian Federation has got us beat. They have all kinds of systems and historical traditions, but they've always had a focus on mathematics and science. And we noticed in TIMSS Advanced, that's why they have their top 2% that practically study mathematics and science 24/7. It's a very, very intensive curriculum for students. And I know in the beginning with TIMSS Advanced, they were quite surprised because pretty much everybody in Russia has a mathematics and science curriculum that is like or better or more rigorous than the one in the United States. So they actually had some trouble understanding the concept of advanced. So that's why then we ended up with their 2%, because to them, that was what was advanced. So it's quite interesting. That's what one learns from working, with these international assessments. And that's why when Jack was starting about the beginning, that was why TIMSS was started, was to learn about these different approaches. So thank you.
Thank you. Another question is about the assessment frameworks. What changes have been made in recent years to the assessment frameworks, and how have these changes affected measuring trends?
Well, I'll start a little bit with mathematics, and also an overview, which is in order to measure trends, we don't change our frameworks very much from time to time. We do things very carefully and gradually. But I think that this enables us to keep up with some changes. For example, in mathematics, in the beginning, there was hardly any mention of the data or statistics or those kinds of areas in the mathematics framework. And that's grown so that more recently, we even have at the 4th grade a strand, a content area on data. And at the 8th grade, we've started to include some probability into that area. I know Mick watches over the science more.
Yeah, it hasn't changed too much. We do review the frameworks with every cycle, but it's more a question of making sure they're up to date and making minor adjustments. But science, I think the emphasis has mostly been on trying to, it goes back to what Jack was saying, science is very diverse, much more so than mathematics, I think, across the countries. So trying to make the framework reflect what's in the countries and then make it easier to write good achievement items from the framework it's always been a challenge. We're always working on that. We also added in an emphasis on science practices, which goes with our content emphasis and our cognitive emphasis as a third sort of dimension or perspective in science. And that's something we've added as well.
I also just
Yeah, go ahead.
been a while since I've looked, but I seem to recall there were some pretty significant improvements in the framework for TIMSS Advanced between administrations.
Well, yes. Over the 20 years from the very beginning of TIMSS Advanced till this most recent cycle, there were changes. I think, though, in what kind of consistent with the results, that in general the curriculum was becoming not quite maybe as difficult or rigorous as it was in 1995. I remember one discussion through the framework where one of the representatives from a country that I won't say just kept saying, this isn't in our curriculum. This isn't in our curriculum, anymore. This isn't in our curriculum anymore. So, there were some pretty dramatic changes in some areas.
Yeah, and some pretty dramatic changes in performance too. A couple of countries in Sweden and France, I mean, they were quite shocked at how much achievement has dropped over the 20 years. And it's, I think, partly what I'm saying, really changes of emphasis in the curriculum. And challenges of getting students to study this advanced content. It's challenging and it's hard work. And you could be doing more fun things with your time.
On the topic of TIMSS Advanced, are you expecting any more countries to participate in TIMSS Advanced in the future? Are we planning on another TIMSS Advanced assessment?
We'd love another TIMSS Advanced assessment, and we know that our some of our Scandinavian colleagues are already making plans. We sort of like what every other assessment model more than every assessment model. So we would hope to have another TIMSS Advanced, and we would hope to have more countries in it.
I think that's
2023. So that's next year.
How many, Mike?
Sorry, I said maybe in TIMSS 2023 we'll offer TIMSS Advanced again.
I think the key, just speaking from former country side, it's that it is the number. It's just like, it's a network effect problem. The more countries you have participating, the more countries want to participate. But sort of getting that primed and getting the country set to expand is tricky. Just having had to try to make that pitch to the budget people and the U.S. government, they want to see, well, who do we get to compare to, and why do I only get to compare those?
Yeah.
A lot of countries too. Sorry, Jack, just to say, a lot of countries have really important examinations in this final year of secondary school, so it's really difficult to get in there with an assessment like TIMSS Advanced, which is, low stakes, and very important, but still low stakes from the student's point of view.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, the other piece I would just add, from the College Board side, one of the things, as you know, but maybe it's not so broadly known yet because I don't think anything's been released. We did an oversample to allow for the measurement of advanced placement students also in TIMSS to try to do some comparison work to see how AP's curricular frameworks in those areas sort of stack up internationally, even with the limited set. And I know that that's a use that Mick, to your point, although maybe some people aren't thinking about it, they could also look at their own national high-stakes assessments and try to use this as a bridge to do some comparative work as we get here.
Great. I think we're going to have to wrap up now as we've reached the end of the time. Once again, I want to thank Ina and Mick for presenting today, and also thank you, Jack, for a very interesting discussion and for all of the questions and answers. Please let us know what you thought of today's webinar by participating in the post-webinar survey that will appear at the close of today's webinar. You can also send your feedback to rise@air.org at any time. Thank you all for joining us. This concludes today's RISE webinar.